And I'm just going to copy that inside of this. Going to bring up Unity as well, just to get ready. Hopefully you guys are going to be good soon. And I'll wait for you guys to come back for a second before we start. Oh man, Cam, there's no way I could read slides and to do this kind of work. It's just takes way too long, right? So you could do it and I could kind of go back and forth. I find that that's not terrible if you're doing something that's very highly technical. But for this kind of work, I find that just much easier if, you know, we just do it by, you know, we're learned by doing, and I give you some examples. I think it's by far, far better. Yeah. Hands-on is definitely better. And the reason for this is, can you use a shared Blender file for your lab? Yeah, if you want to. That's why I put it up for you, Mithu. Again, it's not for me to make you crazy, right? It's to give you some ideas. And hey, what if I was to combine some basic shapes, you know, in Blender? What do I do? How do I bring them into Unity? What does it look like? You know, kind of thing. Does it make sense? Does it look okay? You know, I think this is the kind of stuff I want you to start thinking about, as opposed to just downloading stuff off the asset store. You guys are game students. You guys should know how to do some of this stuff, you know, in my opinion, by hand, right? So since you've taken some courses. All right, let's move on. So a little bit before the time, but welcome back. We are Comp 397 in the summer 2022 semester at Centennial, and it's week 3, part 2 of our broadcast. And let's get back into the Unity part. So here we are in Unity. We just brought a robot in, but there's nothing that the robot can do right now to do anything, because even though the robot's here and it's a very basic robot, it doesn't move or do anything, because although it has a what we call a NavMesh agent, there is no NavMesh associated with our world, if you will, all these tiles. Right? There's no NavMesh. So in order for the robot to work, it needs two things. It needs a NavMesh for it to follow us around, and a NavMesh agent, and some kind of target. Okay, those three things. So we have our NavMesh agent, we have that part, and the robot, but we don't have a target and we don't have a NavMesh. So in order for us to do the NavMesh part, if we look out into our tiles, there's a couple things to note about the NavMesh. We could use the old NavMesh itself. And the old way of doing NavMesh is if I go to Window, and if I go to AI Navigation, so Window, AI Navigation, on the bottom right, it says visit this site, right? And try our experimental component-based way of doing it. And guys, I highly recommend this way. It's much better than doing it the other way. Why? Because I can add it to each tile, and then the tiles will combine and they'll become a NavMesh. That's how kind of I want to do it. And so let's, where it says visit the website, this is the website for my component-based NavMesh. I'm just going to copy this link here and give it to you. And notice that it says 2021.3. We're at 2021. Our version, if you look at our version, is 2021.3, which is a beautiful thing, which means it's going to work nice, right? 2022 is out, but it's not, I don't think it's it's ready in terms of what I want to do. I'm going to wait probably until the fall to use 2022, because I think there's still some stuff. There's going to be a lot of little support packages that are going to come out for 2022. So that's why I'm waiting to do this with what I'm doing right now. So 2021.3 is a kind of a good level of stuff. So I'm going to give you this documentation. So copy and paste. And I'm also going to put this same link here on eCentennial. So on eCentennial, I'm going to kind of add a new link. And this is going to be the documentation for component-based NavMesh. Okay, that's what it is. Just so you have that piece. The component-based NavMesh is kind of neat. Once we set it up, I'm going to pull this up here. And the reason why this is kind of neat is because it gives us all the stuff we need. So how do we install it? Well, you need to go and add a registry package by name. And the registry package is com.unity AI navigation, this package name right here. So this is the package name. I'll put that inside of your chat there for a second. And then how do you add it into Unity? Well, you're going to go into Unity and you're going to go into Window, Edit, and you're going to go to Project Settings. This is Project Settings. And I want to go to Package Manager, right? Now, Package Manager, there's a couple things I want to show you. One is I could enable pre-release packages, and sometimes the pre-release package will be available for us to download ourselves without having to do anything. So if I did this, enable pre-release packages and show the dependencies, we want to do that too. And if I was to go into Window Package Manager now and take a look at the packages in our project, this is packages in the project. You see, these are the ones that we have in here, right? And if I want to go and look at the Unity registry, this is all the Unity registry has with any experimental packages showing as well. So where it says pre, those packages there are all kind of experimental packages for everything from, anything else that's not in here. The other thing is that it says the Visual Studio Code editor and the Visual Studio editor can be upgraded. So Visual Studio editor is definitely we want to update because we're using 2022, right? Remember we had that issue last time. I'm going to add it in, so update to the latest version. Please do that. You should always update your code editor. That's one thing to add in for sure, right? And anything else we need to use should also be updated. Version control is for the plastic SCM. I'm not going to use that part. Visual scripting is if I'm going to use visual scripting, so like no code, low code kind of stuff. And you can see that there's other packages and updates you can add in here as well. So you can see that there's our navigation package is not in here. So how do I add it in? Let's go back to our packages in project. Okay. The way to add that in is you're going to click this little plus here. And you're going to add a package by name, this one, package by name. And you're going to kind of copy paste that package in there, right? com.unity AI navigation and click add. When you do that, it's going to install the package. And notice it's a experimental package. There it is. It says experimental. And it shows us our dependencies if we're going to use any. There's the packages. And there's also another area called samples. Please also download and install this here, import. All right, so we have both samples and the AI navigation that I got you guys to download, okay? Or are you with me? Check mark if you're with me. You downloaded the AI navigation stuff. Okay. I got a couple people. How about the rest? A few. Okay. We still got some other people that can probably do this too. But maybe they're watching. Thank you for that feedback. You have to rewatch, Ada. For the let me show you again. I can show you so you can. Are you behind? Well, how far behind are you, Ada? If you're really behind. Okay. No problem. So so this is great. So I've got my downloads happening. Remember that these are all packages that we've got. These tiles are all packages based on the prefabs, right? All these tiles, right? So if I want a NavMesh to be baked on this thing, right? As an example, here's our world that we made. Then if I go to the prefabs and if I go to tile 1, right? As an example, and if I double click onto it, so I'm inside of prefab mode. Here's tile 1, and let's go to the inspector again. I can certainly add a component. And now you can see that I have some options. I have a NavMesh surface, right, that I could add in there. So new things for NavMesh, right? There's a NavMesh agent, a NavMesh obstacle. You can see that I have a NavMesh link, a NavMesh modifier, a NavMesh modifier volume, and a NavMesh surface. So this is the one I want to use, NavMesh surface. And when I do the NavMesh surface, I can click on bake. And what bake will do is it'll bake the surface here, right? So that it is available for me in the game. So if I go back to the game, right, and I look at the surface for a second, so you can see that there's nothing here. You can, if I look at the navigation, notice that all of these ones that are made from tile 1 have a baked surface. These are all tile 1s, right? And that's just the way we made them, okay? So if I want to do the same thing with the surfaces of tile 2, then I can just double click on tile 2. And then again, just like we did with tile 1, we will go to inspector, we'll click add component and go nav mesh surface. And I can again do a bake, right? And when I do a bake, it bakes the surface, right? Again, based off a humanoid, that's what it does. It looks at the humanoid that we have. And it kind of defaults, it kind of adds defaults in here. If you look at advanced, it talks about area that's walkable and a bunch of other stuff we can do, but we're not going to use all these things. And the reason why we want to do it this way is because when I go back to my scene now, and if I look at navigation, you can see that all of this is pretty good. But the problem with this thing is that they're not connected. So these areas, although they're baked, these are all the areas that I've got baked here. They're individual baked and they're not connected, right? I want to rebake these areas. That's what I want to do. And it'd be also nice, right, for all of these areas, if you kind of look through here, we have areas that are of different heights, right? Because, but they're not connected. So these areas here, which should be nice to be connected, these ones, right? And the reason why they're not is because a typical nav mesh, a normal nav mesh, what they would do is they would kind of connect all these and make it one path. Right now, the enemies would be restricted. If I made an enemy on this tile, then it would be restricted to the navigation path on this tile alone. And I don't want that to happen, right? So what I want is when the tiles are instantiated, right? And you can see there's NavMesh tile 1 in inspector, and there's NavMesh tile 2. They've kind of created two new assets, right? NavMesh tile 1 and NavMesh tile 2. And what I wanted to do is let's clear those things for a second. So I go back to those two tiles, right? And I want to clear the NavMesh surface, right, for each of the tiles. I want to go through each of the tiles, and when I start Unity, I want then to bake everything. I want to bake all the tiles for each object. I want to get the NavMesh surface, and I want to create the bake. I want to bake everything for each of the tiles in my tiles array, right? So what I want to do here is let's make I want to create an empty object. We're going to reset it. And we're going to call this the game manager. And I want to tag it as a game manager or game controller. Let's just call it game controller just to be the same, game controller. There's our game controller. And I want to add a little script. I want to add a little script. So I want to say scripts. Let's make a brand new script, create a new C# script. And we'll call this C# script the navigation controller, right? And I'm going to go to my game controller. You got to wait till the navigation controller is created. Wait for a second. Sometimes, remember, I was too fast last week. We don't want that to happen again. So I'm going to grab this navigation controller and drag and drop it over here. And then what I want to do is I want to double click onto it, and hopefully it's going to add in my code. But remember what happened last time? It's exactly happening again this time. I'm going to go to preferences, and I'm going to go to my external editor and choose Microsoft Visual Studio 2022, right? And it says generate project files for embedded packages and blah, blah, blah. I'll regenerate those project files. And I'm going to say file save and file save project again, and double click on navigation controller, and it should bring now up Visual Studio 2022. Eventually it's going to have be native. 2022 is going to be something that's standard compared to 2019. Up until now, it hasn't been, and that's okay. I'm not really worried. But my navigation controller needs to get a reference to a list of, I want to have a list of objects that I want to have, right? So I want to create a list. Let's make a public list for now, make it easy. Public list. It's going to take time because I'm using C# ReSharper, right? A public list of, come on. Published list of type game object, which we're going to call tiles. And this public list of tiles, I'm going to save that, save. And instead of figuring it out for today, like automatically picking them up, I'm just going to drag and drop it. So you can see that there's an automatic list of tiles. What I want to do is I want to grab all of these tiles here, these tiles, and I want to add them into the game controller. So I want to kind of do, kind of add in all of these tiles. And remember, I can lock the game controller, so I only look at the game controller itself, but I can select all these. And what I can do is I can drag and drop it in there, so I can kind of select all these tiles automatically, which is what I've done. There's 16 tiles here, I've just selected them all. So that list of tiles that I have, which is what I've just done. Let's uncheck this little lock at the top right here. That's how I did it. I locked it, and then I can drag and drop in there. I'm saving it. And what I want to do is for the list of tiles, when I start off, I'll do a for each loop. And what I want to say is for every, in the tiles collection, for every tile in tiles, I want to loop through all the tiles in the tile collection. And I want to say something like, I want to get the tile get component, and I want to look for the NavMesh surface. Here's the NavMesh surface. So I want to get a reference to the NavMesh surface. And what I want to do is when I look at it, notice that it says build NavMesh surface. I want to build the NavMesh surface for each of the tiles. That's what I want to do, right? So once the tiles are in place, I want to look at the NavMesh surface and bake it all. Okay, let's see how this works. Build the NavMesh surface. So if I did that, and if I go back, and if I run it, then what we should see is if I look in the scene now, they're all baked. Take a look at that. They're all baked. And there's some issues, but they also connect for the most part. There are some issues where it doesn't connect, like here in this part. And the reason why it doesn't connect here, guess why? Because of this guy, right? This guy prevents the NavMesh from connecting, right? Because the little robot is there, it doesn't connect, right? So let's get rid of the robot for a second while we do it. So let's try this out again. So again, notice that in the normal view, as long as the robot is not there, let's get rid of that robot. Because remember, he's just a prefab. Let's make sure that if there's any overrides, we'll have them in here. There's no overrides. Let's get rid of the robot, right? And if I did it again, right? So let's do it again. And if I go to look at the mesh, you can see now that when I click at the tiles, here's the tiles, you can see clearly that the mesh has been created for everything and it's kind of together, right? Not bad. And that happened programmatically. I baked the mesh. Okay. So this programmatic baking of the mesh, what it allows me to do is any place that's walkable, then the NavMesh agent, which is our little robot, which we're going to put in place, is here. So if I put the robot back on the tiles, let's put the robot. And what we'll say for the robot is the robot will be disabled at the beginning, but we'll enable it after we bake the mesh. So we bake all the mesh, right? And then what we want to do is after the mesh has been baked, put the robot on the mesh and see what happens. So how does that work? So I need to get a list of robots. Let's put some robots on here, and I'll put them on some of the tiles. So we'll go into the tiles, and here's the tiles themselves. I'll focus on tile number 1, and then I'll just drag and drop a robot on there on tile number 1. So again, I'm going to go to my prefabs, grab the robot, pull them in, and there's my robot, right? On tile number 1, but we'll turn them off. We'll turn off that robot, right? And we'll duplicate that turning off. So when I say turn him off, he's just disabled. The robot's in the scene, but the scene he's been turned off or disabled from the scene, right? So I'm just going to duplicate that guy. So Control D to duplicate that robot and pull him over to this side, this tile, right? And I'll make 4 of them. Control D, and I'll pull him over here on this side and put him somewhere where he can be seen, maybe over here. And Control D, and we'll pull another robot maybe over here on this side, so he's on this side of the screen. And now I have like 4 robots. And what I want to do, since they're all disabled, right, is I want to put them inside of a parent. We'll call this robots. There's the robots, right? They're all kind of in the same thing. And the great thing about this is I can select them all and make them appear, right, or disappear, right? So what I want to do with the game controller is get a list of robots now. So game controller, navigation controller. Let's get a list of robots, right? Again, we can do this in separate, eventually we'll do this in separate things. So again, we'll say public list game object, and we'll say robots. And in the robots, which is the robots controller. So here's my robots. I'm going to pull in, again, I'm going to kind of lock the game controller so I can see it, and take the robots and pull them in like so. Okay. What I want to do is, now that I've got a list of robots, that I have 4 robots that I've got a list of, then what I want to do is for each robot, so after this, we'll say for each robot in robots, we will robot.set active to true. Okay. And let's see if that messes things up if I did this. So I'm going to set them active to true after, that's what I'm hoping to do, I build the NavMesh. Okay. Now this is assuming that the NavMesh is built right away, immediately. Okay. Save. So if I did that and I ran it, and as soon as I kind of go in, the robots are there, but let's see what happened to the NavMesh. Is it still intact? So if I look at the tiles and I click on a tile, we're still good, right? So after I built the NavMesh, then I put the robot on and we're pretty good to go. Robots should be on the NavMesh. Let's see. On the NavMesh, we should make sure that they're on the NavMesh, or else if they're not, that'd be very, very bad, right? There they are. They're on the NavMesh. Awesome. Okay, great. So that worked. So we have the robots on the NavMesh, and what it looks like right now, guys, is this. This is our code. So again, very simple. I got tiles and robots, and I made a couple for loops and activated. Now we need some kind of control for the robot so they can find the player. Okay. This is another script. So we're going to go back to Unity here, and I'm going to right click and create a new C# script. We're going to call this the robot behavior. Actually, more like robot. Yeah, robot behavior is fine. It is behavior. And I want to wait till the script is initialized. I want to go back to the robots. And I want to attach it to the prefab. So under the robot prefab, here's a robot prefab, the robot itself. I want to add that script. So which is the, again, notice that I got to uncheck this. So I see the robot. Here's the robot prefab. And I want to drag and drop this script, the robot behavior script, on there, like so. So that robot behavior is on all robots. Okay. And then I want to double click, and hopefully it'll bring our little script up here. So we got a robot behavior. And the robot behavior that we want it to do is we want to get access to the NavMesh agent for all the robots. So again, what I want to say is I want to have a public NavMesh agent, which we'll call agent, right? And we're going to say that agent is equal to get components. Get components. Let's try that again. Woo, that was great, but really bad actually. Get component NavMesh agent. So we got to find the component or NavMesh agent. And we also need a reference for the robot itself to the player, right? So we're going to say public, right? And we want to have a game object where we call the game object a player. But is it a game object that we want to find? We want to find, we want to be able to find the player's transform, really, not the player itself, just the transform of the player. And the player transform is going to have to be found, right? So that's what we want, the player transform to be found, right? What we want to say is during the update, we want to say that the agents, we want to set destination to the player transform, right? So the player dot position. That's what we want every frame, right? But we don't have the player position, and we need to get that. So we're going to say that player is equal to, again, we want to game object dot find object of type, and we want to look at player behavior, and then we want to take a look at that player behavior object, and we want to look at the transform of that object itself, and that transform is the thing that's going to be attached to the player. So that's the way we can find the player programmatically as opposed to dragging and drop. We don't want to drag and drop because we're placing the object, kind of in place after potentially the player's been in the game. So this is the way we're doing it. Save. And we have our little script. If you notice, the robot script now should have two parts, an agent and a player, and they're empty. But if I go back to our robots here, if I click on any robot, they should have the same script now, because I did it in the prefab, right? All right, let's see if that works. If I press play now, we should have some movement. Let's see if this works. And there it is. There's our robot, and he found me. I don't know how, but he found me. Right? And if I move around, we might even see other robots coming, and I can maybe jump on here, and they're going to kind of loom around and try and get to me, but they can't get me because I can jump on here, and I'm pretty safe up here right now, right? And the way to look at this, you can actually look at the scene and see where the robots are, right? And see if they're following along. So there's my robot, and they're kind of stopped right here. They're kind of floating around. Where's my player? These my players right here, and they're moving really, really slow. And the reason for this is because my player is not on the ground. It's on way up here somewhere. But if I go down here, immediately they kind of come at me again. Until if I kind of move off the grid, right? There might be areas that I can move off the grid where they look at me, but they're not kind of look at me as they move around. There they are. They're moving at me in kind of a very weird looking way, and they're scary as hell, right? And they're going to keep pushing me until I'm pushed, off the world. So we don't want that exactly. So going back to our prefab, let's go back to our prefab, go back to the robot prefab, and where we have the NavMesh agent on the robot, what we want here is to change the stopping distance to something like 2, like as in 2 meters. So make sure that it stops. This is the acceleration. This is the speed. This is the angular speed. We can turn the robot will turn around and try and get you. As an example, let's save that, and then let us go to play again, and let's see how that works now. So now we should see that the robot will stop within 2 meters of me. So if I go here, you know, as an example, it'll stop within 2 meters, right? And 2 meters might be too far, but you know, you can see that there's other robots that are coming, right? Not bad. Where's the 4th robot? That's what I want to know. Well, he's way over here and he's coming too, right? And he's going to try and push his way around too. There's my 4 robot friends. They look pretty scary. And that is your NavMesh agent. Let's save that. File, save project. And let's go through it again. All right, so number 1, I had to, first thing I did when I brought the robot in, I added the NavMesh agent in a capsule collider. The capsule collider will not allow me to go through the robot itself, right? And keeps it off the ground, kind of. I also have the NavMesh agent, and the NavMesh agent, what it does is it follows me around, but the stopping distance, if it's 0, will come right into me, right? And this is kind of, these are automatic things. So you can actually make this a lot more interactive. For example, maybe I don't want my robot to have a destination until the robot sees the player. Because right now, the robots will kind of hunt the player out no matter where they are. They're like seeking robots. They know when the player's on the maze right now, which is kind of weird. The other thing is so we had to add that in. We also had a game controller. This is what we did. And we added all the tiles for the game controller, as well as all the robots in the game controller as lists of game objects. Each tile, remember, we added that experimental NavMesh surface on each of the tiles, right? But we didn't bake it right away. We waited to bake it until the game started. And once the game started, all the meshes baked together, right? Which means they kind of baked at the same time and they connected. All the meshes connected. And when they connected, they created a surface where we could navigate through the entire scene as opposed to only one tile, all right? And this is the great thing about doing this. It was programmatically baked as opposed to pre-baked. If we were to pre-bake this thing, we bake it one time, and then if we want to change anything, we got to bake it again, right? This way it'll bake no matter what we do, which sets up for us for the future when we want to, as an example, we want to procedurally generate our world as opposed to generate our world, with it being, kind of the way we've done it right now, which is just manually generated. We just kind of put the tiles in place. But in the future, I want to procedurally generate it, which means I want to generate my mesh, all my tiles automatically, okay? Okay, so this is pretty cool. I've got my tiles and I baked them, and my game controller does the baking, right, through that list, through a couple of through that script. So if I look at my navigation controller, my navigation controller goes through, finds the tiles, bakes them all, and sets the robots active, because by default, the robots are inactive. And they're inactive because if they're active on a tile, the tile will not bake the mesh properly. We don't want that. We want to bake the mesh first and then make the robots active, which is what we did, okay? One thing to note is in Unity, one thing we should always do is get rid of any of the updates or start methods we do not use, okay? That's important to do. So robot behavior, we have both working, we have those. And we also had, we also had a camera controller and a player behavior. Camera controller, notice we had both the start and update working. And we did the same thing with our player behavior. Player behavior, public, start, and update, they're all working. So if we had anything that was empty, that was not working, we would get rid of it. And this is our first scene. Let's save this and put it up on GitHub, and then we'll stop after we make our scene. We're almost done. If the NavMesh surface, Charlie's asking, why is this important? Because of performance. If I had, every time we have a start or a update function that is empty, what actually happens is Unity hunts for all scripts that are in your scene. So imagine if I had like lots and lots of of objects, as an example, that I had these things attached to. A good example of that is the robot behavior. Robot behavior has both of these things active, right? But if one of these wasn't active, it would hunt through each one of the robot behaviors and check it, right? And it takes up, I'm talking about every frame it does this, right? So every frame, it looks at your start and update functions to make sure that there's something going on. Start is huge. Start, from a startup perspective, if there's a start method that is not being used, get rid of it, okay? We want to get rid of any methods, any of these life cycle methods that are not being used. Let's go back to Jesus. Jesus says NavMesh surface can't be found. The only reason that might happen is if you're in the, that's in the navigation controller. If your NavMesh surface can't be found, you need to add in the using statements above. My using statements were automatically added in because I'm using ReSharp or C#. You may not have that, so you need to add in unity.ai.navigation at the top, and then your NavMesh surface should be found. Try that, okay? Because remember, we added in the unity.ai navigation package, and that's why it works. So does that fix your problem, Jesus? It should. No problem. Next, so once we have all this, this is a great place to put it up on GitHub. So let's do that. So again, I'll say file, save project. And then we'll, I'm going to exit. And I'm going to go to our desktop Centennial. And I want to go into this and just remove the extra SLN file because we don't need it. We only need one. Get rid of that, save. And then let's put this up on GitHub by going into our GitHub desktop, which is right here. I'm going to say we added nav mesh surfaces to all files, right? Which is what we did. We enabled everything to work. Okay. And let's push this up to GitHub. There we go. So now everything is there for you guys to compare your code with my code. Again, if you're always falling behind, you can always look at my code on GitHub and compare it. Say, hey, did I do it the right way? Did Tom do this? Or did I do something else? Next, last part is making that scene work. So if I go back in lab 3, I want to be able to have two scenes. One scene that we start off with and the other scene that we're going to go to. We're not going to have time to push the WebGL today because it's already 3:29. But I want to make that scene where we have from one scene, a start scene, and then this play scene. So let's make a new scene really quickly. Create a new scene. And this new scene is going to be called start. And the start scene, one thing that we're going to have in the start scene is it's going to have a menu, right? And so we can go and double click on there. We have a main camera in the start scene. But the main camera right now, we really don't care about seeing it in 3D mode. What we want is to add in for some UI, we want to add a couple things in there. I want a panel to be added in. And here is the panel, right? And let's take a look at it in 2D mode. And notice the panel takes up the entire screen. We don't maybe don't need it in the entire screen. So what I want instead, we'll call this panel, it's fine. But notice that it stretches in all directions. We don't want that to stretch in all directions, right? So we're going to just select the middle, like so. And then what I can do is I can go to the panel and resize it. So it kind of moves like so. Kind of the center of the screen kind of looks like this. And in the game, it would kind of look like this right now. Again, you can make it even smaller if you really want to. So if you don't want to make it so it takes up the entire screen space, because right now we're in free aspect. If you want to check it with WebGL, it would kind of look like something like this. And what we can do is we can move it in. So you can see that the panel is going to be something like this. Maybe a little bit not as wide. And I'm just sizing it with the grid in the background. I don't know if you guys can see the grid. There is a grid. and then I'll change everything. So the height, the width is going to be 500. And the height is going to be something like 680 pixels to make it exactly the same. From a position X and Y, if I made it 0 and 0, this is a good idea to make everything 0, 0, 500 and 680 like this. So it looks kind of like this. And then I want to add into the panel itself, I want to add a button and a label. Let's add the button first. So in UI, I want to have a text mesh pro, where it's going to ask me to import text mesh pro essentials. I will. I'll take a second. I don't want to have the extras. And here, I'm just going to rename this thing the welcome label, or the start game label, maybe start game label. And it's going to say, welcome to our game. And you can say whatever it's going to say, but I'm just going to bring this so that it's kind of up here. And it's going to take the width of the panel, same width as the panel. So again, the width, if you notice, is in this case is 200, right? And that's fine. And what I want is for the label to be centered. So I'm going to choose down in here, I'm going to choose kind of center and center. Welcome to our game. And that's what it looks like now. Welcome to our game. And then there's going to be a button. Let's add a button to the panel too. So we're going to add a UI button. Very simple. There it is. Here's our button. And we're going to say this is the start button. And inside of our start button, we're going to have a start button label. Right? And this will be something like start. And it's not too exciting right now, but it's just a placeholder for we're going to add some more interesting stuff later on. And remember how we make this go when we start our game. I'm going to click the start button and it's going to go to the new scene, to the main scene, right? Nice. So in order for us to do this, we need another thing here, some kind of game controller. Let's add that in. So new empty object called game controller. And we'll make it reset. We always want to reset the game controller so it's in the middle. And let's do under scripts, we'll have a UI. We can also, we can call this the start game, the start scene controller, if you want. C# script, start scene controller, right? And the start scene controller is going to be attached to the game controller eventually. There it is. Start scene controller, what it's going to do is when I click on the button, right, then it's going to take me to the main scene, okay? But in order for me to do that, I need to register both scenes, both the start scene and the main scene in my game itself. And the way to do that is if you go to File, Build Settings, you can add open scenes to the game, plus drag and drop other ones. So you can notice that start is scene 0 and main is scene 1. Okay. So now what I can do is with my start scene controller, if I double click, did it again. One day it's going to fix. I'm not worried about it. I know what it does now. So it's not totally terrible. And we know what the problem is. There we go. So double click, and when it double clicks, there we go. What we want it to do is we want to be able to go from one scene to the other. And we want to use the scene manager to do that, okay? But we want some kind of method for us to enable for us to do that. For now, we're going to put that method here, right? So we're going to call this the on start button click. So it's going to be a public void on start button click event. Okay, that's the event handler that we're going to use. And we're going to use the scene manager. And we're going to say that we want to load a scene that is called main. That for now is what we're going to do. So when we click the start button, that's what's going to happen. For now, we don't need the start or the update. So let's get rid of them. Like I said, so all it has is this one method. Okay. And now that we have this method in the start scene controller, then if I go to back to our scene, I can connect the button to that method, right? And the way to do that is if I go to the start button, if I scroll down, it has an on click event by default. You can also make your own, but in this on click event area, right, what I want to do is I want to add to the list. I want to drag and drop the game controller, the whole game controller on there. And what it does, it allows me to choose the start scene controller and choose the on start button click event, like so. You cannot drag the start scene controller script directly onto this on click event. It will not work. Okay. Okay, if everything goes well, if I press play, then we should see the start scene is the one I'm starting with. Yay. And if I hover, you can see that all the regular things for the button work. If I click start, it's going to get into my start scene. And we get right into these robots chasing me. Okay. But I can outrun them because that's how we have our game right now. We can look at the robots and, you know, they can't even find me right now because I'm in places where they can't get to. They know where I am because they can look right at me, right? Take a look. They should be looking closer to me, but they can't move towards me because I'm up here right on the roof. Sorry. So, Jesus, you were asking, where was the scene in the file project management? Okay, so let's go back. So in file build settings, I put those two scenes in, start scene and main scene. And the way I did that, there's two ways to do that. You can add open scenes, or you can go to scenes and drag and drop from here inside of there in the order that you want your game to start, right? So for example, the start scene will start first, then the main scene, okay? You must have both of those scenes in here in build settings, because if you don't have them, then if you go to that little game controller that we had before in the start scene, you cannot do this part right here, the scene manager load scene. And in order for you to do scene manager load scene, you have to use using Unity Engine scene management up here for it to work. Okay. If you don't put this in, you won't be able to do scene manager. Scene manager is the one that's going to make you go. Clear? So that is your start scene. So really, when we look back at our PowerPoint, we've kind of accomplished all the things we wanted this week. We had a built-in enemy robot. We used a sketch, a really bad sketch of what the enemy robot was. We started with the mesh, right? We downloaded a texture, optional. We applied multiple materials to the model. We did that, even though it's optional. UV mapping we didn't do. That was optional if we had time. We imported the FBX file into Unity. We built a simple NavMesh. We did that. Added a NavMesh agent to our robot model. And in Unity, we created a simple menu scene, built a simple UI in the Unity scene, transitioned to the main scene from the main scene. We did not build for WebGL. We didn't have time for that. And we did not deploy to GitHub pages. We didn't have time for that either this time around. We'll do that next week, okay? But that is your lab 3. And inside of your lab 3 details, if you look up online in your live session, there is in your assignment for lab 3, there is a lab 3 report, just like before. There is this lab 3 report. Please take a look there. When you submit, you need to put that in there in order for it to work. Okay, for you to get full marks. All right, so do the same thing that you did last time, and you should be good. Any questions before we go? I'm just going to file, save project, and exit. So I think we've done everything we want to do today. Okay. And I'm going to put this up, the final version up on GitHub. So we'll say added start scene. Commit to main, and we're going to push to storage. Any questions before we go? Yeah. on the click event, what was the setting? Okay, sorry, let's get back in there and I'll show you. So lab 3. All right, so yeah, so there's if I go back in here, what you're asking is inside of the button itself. If I go back to the button, and if you look inside the start button, if you scroll down, has this on click event. You need to click the plus, which adds an empty slot. And then what you need to do is drag and drop your whole game controller that contains the scene controller that we just built with that single event, right? And to drag and drop that game controller right on the start button here. And the way you do that is I'm just gonna collapse all these, is you just do one of these. Just take that start button and drag it in there, right? Oh, sorry, the game controller, and drag it into the start button. And then what you do is you go to the, because the game controller has a start scene controller attached to it, it should appear here, right? And then you go to your start scene controller and you navigate to the event we made, the method, which is the on start button click event. And that should be the way, once you click onto it, it'll connect the event to the button. Okay. All right, excellent. Any other questions before we go? Okay, assignment 1, for the assets library section of the GDD, do you need to put the model in Blender or just a screenshot of the asset? So I recommend for the assets, it's going to be like almost like an asset, like you make a little table, I recommend. And let's say this is the model, what you need. Let's say, for example, the player model. Where did you get it from? Did you make it, or did you get it from a certain site? Did you get it from a Unity asset store? That's what you put in, almost like, here's the model, what is it for, and where did you get it from? Okay, pretty simple. Anyone else have any questions? Could I see your robot's parent object? Sure. So that's in the other scene. Let's go into the other scene for a second. So in main. And if I look at my my prefabs robot, then if you see the prefab robot, there's 2 parts. There's the robot parent object, which has 2 parts. There's a capsule collider, which I added in. And I just made it so that the capsule collider was kind of looking like this. This is the surface of the robot. Well, then I made it so that the surface of the robot was just touching the surface of the object. So I kind of made it so it kind of came to its head and it was just touching the ground. That's what I did. And that's why the robot's capsule collider is 0.99915 in terms of the Y. It kind of moved up a little bit. And that's the offset for the center. And its radius is 0.5, its height is 2. You can make it slightly less than 2. And the direction means it goes up and down on the Y-axis, which is pretty cool. The NavMesh agent, the only thing I changed was the stopping distance to 2. And I added robot behavior, which allows me to move everything around. Is that good enough? One? No problem. Anyone else have any questions? All right, guys, so that's it for today. I know that it wasn't totally exciting, but it was something. There's another question from Yuk. For GDD, if we do the tower defense game and we have no player character, does it mean that the player avatar is the camera? Yes, it would mean that. For the key binding in the option screen, is it expected to something like moving the camera using WASD? It could be, key binding is really what we want to think about is if I want to move the camera around with WASD, you could. You could also move the camera around with the game controller if you're going to have game controller support, as an example. But what I've asked you to do also is I want you to be able to rebind the keys to something else, right? So let's say, for example, instead of WASD, you chose the player is a left-handed player instead of a right-handed player. And they want to use the numpad as, the keys to move around. With their left hand being on the mouse, they should be able to do that. Okay. And so we want to rebind the control keys to the numpad as opposed to the WASD keys. That's how it should work, okay? However, I want you also to keep in mind, Yuk, and for everyone else here, what happens when we go to mobile? Because you're going to take the same project and over time, you're going to move it into mobile development space. How does that work? And the way to think about this for mobile development is think about right and left-handed people, right? Maybe that is the mode you want to do because it works both on the mobile side as well as, you know, here. And the reason why is you may want to think about presets, okay, as opposed to let them pick whatever they want. Because if you let them pick whatever they want, how does that work on mobile? What are you gonna do? Let them drag and drop keys around the user interface? It's possible, but it's complex, is what I'm saying. And maybe you don't want that, right? So maybe what you want instead is you have two modes and you turn on and turn off modes. So I want to select from a preset, left-handed or right-handed, you know, as an example. I'm just making a recommendation. You don't have to do what I'm telling you, but I recommend it, right? And the reason for this is because we're going to go to mobile eventually. So just think about that. Keep that in mind, okay? Any other questions around that? For assignment 1, part 1, is anything expected in version control in GitHub for Unity as part as 1 is related to documentation? Yeah, you still got to put it up on GitHub, Ithul. So you still have to put your initial commit up there, and when you add assets to the project, you can make more commits, right? That's what the version control is all about. You're building your project. That's what you're doing. Okay. Anyone else have any questions? All right, guys, I think we went way over, but I'm happy to answer your questions. Thank you so much for sticking around with me today and hanging out with me. All of this stuff we've done, again, is freely available for you up on GitHub. I'm hoping that it's going to help you with building your Lab 3. But I'm really happy with participation today with the stuff that the people that have been here. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you guys next week. I'm looking forward to seeing your assignment 1, part 1 on Sunday. Thank you. Take care.